One evening, I asked a client, "Why don't you just leave her?" He looked at me like I had asked him to stop breathing. I've met many men who cheat. What stays with me isn't the affair, it's the refusal to leave. I'm a legal escort in Australia. I've heard more honest confessions in dimly lit rooms than most therapists ever will. And over time, I realized these men aren't chasing sex. They're running from something deeper. This isn't a story about infidelity. It's a story about survival. If this topic feels worth listening to, click the like button, subscribe, and comment love below. I want to know who's truly staying with me. He was in his late 50s. Silver watch, tailored shirt, the kind of man who looked like he always had a plan. But when he sat down, there was a long silence. Then he said, almost whispering, "I love her, but I also love my wife." That wasn't the first time I heard a line like that. It won't be the last. Men come to me with two hearts beating out of sync. One heart races with desire, restlessness, the thrill of something new. The other beats slowly, quietly, with memories, routines, and a kind of soft loyalty that doesn't make headlines but holds them in place. They live between these two pulses, and most of the time, they don't want to lose either one. The truth is, a lot of men don't cheat because they've stopped loving their wives. They cheat because they don't know how to live without them. It sounds contradictory, but it's real. For many of these men, the home they share with their wives isn't just bricks and furniture. It's history. It's the sound of the same kettle boiling each morning, the way the back door creaks, the dog that still waits by the table. It's the smell of someone who's seen you through every version of yourself, even the worst ones. That kind of familiarity isn't exciting, it's not sexy, but it's safe. And safety, for a man who's spent decades building a life, is everything. He might meet someone who makes him laugh harder, breathe faster, feel younger. But when the night ends, he still drives home, not because he's guilty, not even because he's afraid. But because that house, that woman in it, is part of who he is. Leaving her would be like cutting off a limb, painful, permanent, and nearly impossible to explain. I remember one client who brought me a bracelet on our second meeting. Not expensive, but delicate, something you depict with care. I asked if he bought jewelry often. He shook his head. "No," he said, "I usually buy things for my wife, birthdays, anniversaries, but with her, it's never about the thing. It's about remembering. I still want her to know I'm thinking of her, even when I'm not home." That's what I mean. Some men stray not because they've stopped caring, but because they care too much to let go. Their wives represent the life they've built, the story they've told for decades, the place where their children grew up, the seasons they endured, the inside jokes, the old fights. The way they fought together against job loss, a bad diagnosis, a broken parent, or a funeral that took the light out of their house for weeks. And no matter how tempting a new chapter may seem, they can't throw that book away. For many men over 50, walking away from a marriage is not a clean break. It's a collapse. It feels like a failure, not just of love, but of character, so they stay. And sometimes, staying looks like showing up for dinner with someone you no longer desire, but still deeply respect. And sometimes, it looks like finding that desire elsewhere, while quietly praying your wife never finds out. I'm not saying that's right, I'm saying it's real. It's easy to judge from outside, but if you've ever built a life with someone brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice, you know that leaving isn't just walking out the door. It's losing your place in a world you helped create, and that world still matters even when the fire's gone out. So no, they don't leave, they go out, they explore, they sin, they hide, they try to quiet the ache in their chest. But they come home because deep down they still believe that home is where they're safest, even if it's no longer where they're happiest. And that's the nest they're not ready to leave. The next client who opened up to me wasn't poetic. He didn't talk about love or loyalty or the smell of home. He sat on the edge of the bed, leaned forward, and said flatly, "I can't afford a divorce." At first, I thought he meant legal fees, but he wasn't talking about money, not exactly. He meant the whole package. The house he'd spent 30 years paying off, the retirement plan with both names on it, the social circles built around coupledom, and most of all, the illusion of being a successful man. In his world, divorce meant failure, not just of a marriage, but of a narrative, and failure, especially public failure, was worse than unhappiness. For men over 50, life isn't just about what they feel, it's about what they've built. They've been taught since boyhood to measure their worth in stability, output, reputation. Marriage, in that sense, becomes a kind of trophy. It says, I did what I was supposed to, I kept it together. To leave would be to admit that something broke, that something slipped out of their control, and many would rather betray a vow in private than admit defeat in public. One man, maybe in his early 60s, explained it better than any therapist could. If I walk away, he said, I don't just lose her, I lose my kids, their respect. I lose Sunday dinners. I lose friends who'll pick her side. I lose the version of me that everyone else still believes in. Then he looked at me with quiet exhaustion and added, and for what? A woman I barely know who might leave me too. There's a kind of pragmatism in that pain. These men aren't deluded. They know what they're doing. They know sneaking out to see someone like me doesn't solve anything, but it gives them one thing they crave more than sex: relief. A space where they're not being watched, judged, or asked to explain. A few hours where they don't have to carry the entire structure of their life on their shoulders. Some people might say, if he's that unhappy, why not just end it? But they underestimate how many threads are wrapped around a long marriage. Divorce doesn't just separate two people. It pulls apart bank accounts, memories, family routines, holiday plans, even future expectations. It turns us into me, and not all men are ready for that kind of solitude. Especially not men who have spent their entire adult lives sharing an identity. There's also the fear of what comes next. One man told me, at my age, I won't find another wife. I'll just be an old guy trying to date women who want something I no longer have. He wasn't being cynical, he was being honest. For many of these men, the affair isn't about starting over. It's about holding on to desire, to relevance, to the illusion that something inside them is still alive and wanted. Another client said it best, halfway through a cigarette on my balcony. You're not the problem, he said. You're the reason I don't blow my whole life up. That wasn't flattering, but it was sobering. They don't stay because they're cowards, they stay because they're cornered. Because the cost of walking away, financial, emotional, reputational, is too high. And in that corner, they make deals with themselves. They say, I'm still a good husband, just complicated. They say, no one needs to know, it's just this once. They say it's better than destroying everything. Maybe they're right. Maybe they're not, but either way, they're not ready to pay the price of truth. And so they live in a fragile truce between what they want, what they have, and what they fear they'll lose if they ever admit the truth out loud. One of my regulars carried an old photograph in his wallet. It was his wedding picture, him in a tuxedo with dark hair, her in soft lace smiling like the future was already in her hands. He never showed it to me on purpose. I saw it once when he paid in cash and the photo slipped out with the bills. He didn't rush to hide it. Later that night, after the quiet had settled in, he admitted something most men wouldn't dare to say aloud. I don't want her gone. I just don't want her body anymore. That sounds brutal, I know, but it wasn't cruel, it was honest. And it wasn't the first time I'd heard a man draw that line between affection and desire, between history and hunger. For many men, especially those well into their 50s, marriage becomes a space of emotional loyalty but physical numbness. They still love the woman they married. They care about her health, her routines, her mood swings, even the way she organizes the refrigerator. But they don't burn for her. That kind of fire, they say, faded years ago, replaced by domestic rhythm, medical appointments, grown-up kids, and evening television. They don't cheat because they hate their wife. They cheat because they can't feel like a man next to her anymore. And for some, that quiet ache becomes unbearable. One man once told me, she's the mother of my children and I'd take a bullet for her, but I don't remember the last time we kissed like we meant it. That sentence stayed with me because what he described wasn't betrayal. It was grief. He wasn't angry. He was mourning something that had died slowly with no funeral. Men are rarely taught how to process emotional decay. They're taught how to fix things, cars, roofs, careers, but not how to mend intimacy that dissolves without anyone doing anything wrong. So when the silence between husband and wife becomes heavier than the house itself, they don't always confront it. They sidestep it, and sometimes that means finding someone else to remember what wanting used to feel like. I'm not that someone for most of them. I'm not a fantasy. I'm just a mirror. A quiet space where they don't feel invisible. Where a hand on their chest doesn't mean obligation. Where eye contact isn't a battleground of resentments stored over decades. There's no competition between me and their wife. I'm not trying to replace anyone. But in that moment, in that room, I become the reflection of who they were before everything got heavy. And for a few hours, that's enough. Another client once confessed, I still do her laundry. I still hold her hand at doctor's appointments. But in bed, it's like I'm lying next to a photograph. He didn't want to leave. He didn't even want a new life. He just wanted a pulse, something to make him feel alive. Some people think love dies when attraction fades. But that's not true. Love stays, sometimes long after the body forgets. It stays in the way he checks if she locked the door, in the way he orders her favorite soup without asking, in the quiet pride he takes in keeping her safe, even if they sleep in separate worlds. But desire needs a different kind of space. One with risk, with edge, with no grocery lists in the background. And when that space disappears from the marriage, some men go looking for it elsewhere. Not because they've stopped loving their wife, but because they can no longer see themselves through her eyes. So they come to me not to be saved. Not even to be adored, just to remember what it feels like to be wanted by someone who doesn't see a husband, a father, or a mortgage. Someone who sees a man, still there, still breathing, still burning. He was one of the most organized men I'd ever met. Booked appointments months in advance, always punctual, always polite. He once joked that juggling a wife and a mistress was like managing two companies. I laughed. But deep down, I knew he wasn't kidding. A surprising number of men I meet truly believe they can live two lives at once. And for a while, many of them do. They have breakfast with their wife, dinner with their lover. They go to their daughter's graduation, then check into a hotel with someone who makes them feel like they're 30 again. They buy groceries in the afternoon and send poetic texts at night. And they convince themselves this is balance, not betrayal. I once asked a client how he kept it all from falling apart. He smiled and said, discipline and good memory. It wasn't arrogance, it was strategy. These men aren't reckless. They're careful, they're deliberate. They don't want to lose what they've built, marriage, family, respectability, but they also don't want to lose the thrill, the affirmation, the spark. And when no one's forcing them to choose, they simply don't. They compartmentalize, one room for loyalty, another for lust, one life in daylight, another after dark. It works until it doesn't. Eventually, something breaks. A forgotten phone, a change in routine, a stray receipt, or worse. The mistress wants more, or the wife becomes suspicious, or the man himself starts to unravel under the weight of his own duplicity. But until then, they live in the illusion of duality, and that illusion is powerful. You might wonder, why would someone do that to their spouse? But for these men, it's not always about disrespect. Sometimes it's about fear of hurting their wife, fear of disappointing their children, fear of being alone. And underneath all that, fear of being seen only as old, tired, used up. In their minds, they're protecting everyone. They're holding the marriage together by removing their unmet needs from the equation. They're giving their wife the stability she deserves while outsourcing desire somewhere it won't cause damage, at least not immediately. One man said it plainly, I cheat to save my marriage. It's twisted logic. But in his world, it made sense. He didn't want to burden his wife with what he called the parts of me that are still alive. He believed he was doing her a favor, shielding her from his cravings, his midlife insecurities, his aching need to still feel wanted. But here's what they don't say out loud. They're not just protecting their marriage. They're protecting their image, the image of the good husband, the reliable father, the successful man who never stumbles. To tear down that image would mean facing questions they're not ready to answer, even from themselves. So they perform, they act, they rehearse kindness and routine. And in the spaces where they can't be that man anymore, they seek out someone like me. I'm not offended by this, I understand it. Because while they think they're having both, what they're really doing is splitting in half. And the cracks show in the way they fall silent when I ask too much, in the way they check their phone more than they look me in the eye, in the way they seem more tired with every visit, even when nothing physical has happened. Double lives are heavy, and the longer you live them, the harder they are to carry. But many of these men won't stop, because in their mind, letting go of one woman means losing everything. And they'd rather lie to everyone, wives, lovers, even themselves, than start over empty-handed. They think they can have both. But what they really have is a slow erosion of trust, presence, and peace. And deep down, some of them know it. They just hope they can delay the collapse long enough to get through one more week, one more dinner, one more quiet lie that keeps the illusion alive. He was quieter than most, wore glasses, always folded his jacket before sitting down. I didn't think he'd talk much, but one night without warning he said, "I used to know who I was." That sentence landed heavy, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so common. So many men come to me not chasing passion, but trying to remember the man they used to be before everything else. Before fatherhood, before routine, before life became a series of obligations. They say they're looking for excitement, or escape, or connection. But beneath all those words is something simpler, more tender, and more tragic. They miss themselves. The version of them that felt sharp, desired, wild. The man who once walked into a bar and felt like he owned the room. The man who kissed like it meant something. The man who could laugh without looking over his shoulder or checking the time. Marriage doesn't erase that man, but time does. And in long relationships, especially ones that stretch through decades, identity becomes tangled in roles: husband, provider, protector, fixer. These roles are noble, but they also ask something enormous: the quiet burial of selfhood. One client told me, "I don't know the last time someone touched me without needing something." That wasn't about sex, that was about being seen. Sometimes they come to me not to cheat, but to feel visible again. To be touched without being asked to carry a bag, solve a problem, pay a bill, explain a feeling. They want to be wanted, but more than that, they want to feel real. Another man, tall, athletic, probably handsome, once stood by the window for most of our time together. He said, "I walk into my house and I'm a ghost. Everyone sees me, but no one looks." He wasn't angry, he was defeated. He loved his family, he'd never leave. But somewhere along the way, he stopped existing in his own eyes. He became a role, a function, a wallet, a chauffeur, a distant body beside another distant body. That kind of emptiness doesn't scream, it hums, soft and constant. And after years of pretending not to hear it, these men start listening. Not with their ears, but with their hunger, their hesitation, their decision to book someone like me, not for pleasure, for presence. And here's the thing, I don't pretend to fix them, I don't give them advice. But I do something their lives rarely allow. I hold space, I look, I listen, I don't interrupt. In that quiet, some of them find something they didn't know they were missing: not love, not sex, but recognition. One man said, "I feel like I've been living in third person." He wasn't alone, so when people ask me, why don't these men just divorce? I think of that sentence, because divorce wouldn't bring them back to themselves. It would just add another identity to the pile: divorced man. They're not seeking a new woman, they're trying to reclaim the old man. That search doesn't always make sense from the outside, but on the inside, it's deeply human. And sometimes it leads them to me not for rescue, but for reminder. So they keep the wife, they keep the job, they keep the polite smiles at dinner parties, but once in a while they step outside the lines. Not to betray, not to abandon, but to breathe. Because when a man feels like he's vanished inside his own life, the most dangerous thing isn't what he might do, it's what he might lose within himself if he does nothing. I don't defend cheating, I'm not here to justify betrayal. But I've sat across from enough men to know this isn't just about desire or boredom. It's about quiet grief, about feeling erased, about carrying the weight of a life that looks perfect from the outside but feels hollow when the doors close. Many of these men are not proud of what they do. They're not villains, they're not predators. They're tired hearts with unfinished sentences. They're men who made promises before they knew how long forever really is. And now they live between duty and longing, afraid that choosing either will break something they can't fix. One told me, "I'm not cheating on my wife. I'm cheating on the version of myself that gave up years ago." It's not romantic, it's not noble, but it's real. And I've learned to meet that truth without flinching. Because if you've ever loved someone and still felt alone, if you've ever woken up and wondered who you've become, then you know this isn't a story about infidelity. It's a story about being human. If this story made you pause just for a moment, click like, subscribe, and comment love below. Maybe what you're searching for is also waiting to be heard.